Hi, everybody. Once again, my name is Michał Ogorzałek. I work in securing as an IT security consultant, where I mainly perform security tests of web applications. And last year, I had an opportunity to hack webinar platforms. Just for you to know, webinar platforms are slightly different from standard web conference platforms. The webinar platforms, typically, the presenter speaks to the attendees, and webinar attendees do not interact with one another. The popularity of webinars was already rising before the current pandemic. It is hard to give you accurate statistics now, but in 2020, the number of webinars grew 162%. So webinars are more and more popular. Okay, I was hacking webinar platforms, but not because I'm bad and I like breaking things. So let me start with our story. Everybody realized that the pandemic has changed the world. Most of our communication with the client, presentations and trainings had to be transferred to the remote world. So our company started looking for a suitable platform which would enable us to provide knowledge to our clients. And one of our colleagues prepared for us webinar using third-party platform to test its possibilities. He was the host and the presenter. We were attendees. He was talking, sharing his screen, showing us the whiteboard. And after 5 minutes of the webinar, strange things started to happen. Firstly, somebody wrote indecent words on the webinar's whiteboard. Then, my colleague, who was the host and the presenter, was kicked out of the meeting. And instead of him, another of my colleagues became a host. I've already knew what happened. We are pen testers, we are hackers for hire. And during the webinar, my colleagues started hacking the webinar platform, and one of them managed to find and exploit vulnerabilities in just a few minutes. Since the platform was not secure enough, we decided to find another one. However, the problem happened again. The second platform also had crucial vulnerabilities, and those company owners asked me and my colleague, Jakub Korepta, to press the hack button and verify the security of other platforms to get a view of how safe available solutions are. Before we began, we had defined assumptions of our research. We've selected the most popular webinar platforms based on the Majestic Million and spent about an hour per platform testing. We are hacking real application, right? So not to break the law, we're testing from only one account on a platform, and only data related to the test account was accessed. A lot of things can go wrong in the context of webinar security. However, our main goal was to gain the host or presenter privilege, either by an anonymous attacker or by an attendee of a meeting. Before I start, let me explain how webinar platforms work. Generally, webinar platforms are web applications, and they use HTTP protocol for communication between browser and server, client and server. A browser sends an HTTP request to the server and gets an HTTP response. Based on this response, a user interface of the application is created in the browser. But it is not enough when operations are to be performed in real time. To keep every participant up to date with the meeting data, the messages being sent, the user being kicked out, etc., another protocol is used, namely WebSocket. For you to remember is that the WebSocket protocol is bidirectional. And while using it, we create a connection between a client browser and a server. So messages can be sent in both directions. For example, if a host sends a message or mutes a participant, WebSocket protocol is used to inform all participants about the change, okay? During our test, we encountered a whole range of vulnerabilities, but we focused mainly on 3 aspects. Privilege escalation, either by role modification or by access control issues, or sensitive information in the browser. It is a sensitive data of attendees or private conversations. Okay, so let's start hacking. How hard is to become a host? I see this button, I click this button, and I join a webinar. Then I intercept messages between my browser and the application server. Analyzing messages, I see that there is a very interesting parameter in communication, the role. What do you think? What can I do with this? I can change the value of the parameter to host or to presenter, depending on the platform. So let's change the value of the parameter. Now let's wait a few seconds till resources are loaded. And I am a host. I am a host. That's all. The user interface is generated for the host. I can perform all operations. I can share my screen. I can even kick the former host out of the meeting. I am the owner of the meeting. All I had to do was modify the value of one parameter related to the role of a user. Easy, right? We've tested 14 platforms overall, and in 2 of them, it was possible to become a host of a webinar in such a trivial way. Okay, it was in 2 platforms, but what about the rest? Even if the application does not allow user to modify their roles, it still can have access control issues. As we can see, some of the functions are available only for administrators, hosts, or presenters. For example, making another user a presenter. As an attendee, I cannot use this function in user interface. However, by using the WebSocket connection that I have between my browser and the application server, I can send this prepared WebSocket message and add new presenter. Okay, I execute the function add new presenter. This is my ID. Okay, I send this message and I am a presenter. Okay, I added myself as a presenter. What can I do now? I can send another WebSocket message and execute other function to kick TrueHost out of the meeting. I execute other function like user. And this is ID of John TrueHost. I send this message and voila, host is kicked out. I couldn't modify the role just like before. However, the result is exactly the same. The host is kicked out of the meeting and I have full control over the webinar. All I did was send 2 WebSocket messages. That's all. It all results from a complete lack of access control. Server hasn't verified the privileges, and I was able to execute administration functions. During our test, we've noticed a very interesting thing. In most cases, access control in HTTP communication was implemented properly. However, not in WebSocket messages. If we found some application vulnerable, the problem was global. There was no access control in any function that uses WebSockets. Not counting application that we had simply by role modification, 3 other had access control issues which allowed us to escalate privileges. Third common vulnerability that we found was sensitive information in the browser. For example, a webinar administrator or host has access to personal data of attendees, like full name, like email, date of the birth, almost everything that was supplied during registration. Attendees can see only nicknames. However, the data is sent to the browser of every attendee. The client-side application decides whether the data should be displayed or not. So, if attendees analyze the traffic that comes to their browsers, they will access the data. Similar when sending private messages during the webinar. User 2 is not able to see in the browser messages that are sent to user 1. However, the message is sent to every single attendee. And by analyzing the traffic that comes to the browser, they can read them. They can read this private message. Got it? Guess how many platforms had vulnerabilities related to sensitive information exposure? Half of them. We also found other vulnerabilities which allowed, for example, spoofing messages or bypassing client-side validation. A lot of other things can go wrong in the context of the webinar security, but we cannot cover it all during our presentation. So let's sum up. We've tested 14 platforms overall, and in 5 of them, we were able to escalate our privileges, either simply by role modification or by exploiting access control issues. And half of the tested platforms had vulnerabilities related to sensitive information exposure. The next step was to convey details of vulnerabilities to appropriate people responsible for security of these solutions. As it turned out, it was harder than finding bugs. Since there was no dedicated contact on any website, our first shot was technical support. Obviously, details of security vulnerabilities could not be passed to a random person from support, right? So we pushed for giving us a contact to a person responsible for the security. It looked like that. So we would like to inform that there is a serious vulnerability in the application. An attendee can become a presenter without privileges. Could you give us a contact to person responsible for security, please? And they respond with something like, okay. This is the security issue. We are able to bypass your security mechanism. Maybe in some other words. This is dangerous for users of your application. Could you give us a contact to security, please? Let's click the link. There is no contact information here. Maybe you can escalate the problem and contact me with some technical people. Don't try to talk with support about technical stuff. It's completely useless. Sometimes we weren't getting any response, and when we got, it was the same story over and over again. not technical people were not able to understand the problem, and there was no process to handle a vulnerability reporting. Because of that, we started looking for a person responsible for security, or at least let's say a competent person in LinkedIn. It was definitely a better solution, and in the end, we managed to report vulnerabilities to 4 companies. 2 of them fixed vulnerabilities in a week. The third one fixed them partially in a month. The last one has not fixed vulnerabilities yet. Okay, that's it. I hope that our research showed that sometimes it is enough for security specialists like me or like Jakub to spend an hour to find critical vulnerabilities. And I would like you to remember that similarly to other SaaS applications, webinar platforms also have vulnerabilities. Security tests should involve all applications, including those provided by external vendors. And vulnerabilities happen in application. From my point of view, very important is how these vulnerabilities are handled, if they are handled. Let's say how much a company cares about security. The problems that I talked about today are not limited to just webinar platforms, but also many other web applications. For example, chat, for example, help desk or online training. Generally, all web applications which use WebSocket for instant two-way communication with the browser. Most of the vulnerabilities that we found were caused by lack of access control. And like I said earlier, during our test, many applications had access control implemented properly for HTTP communication, but not for WebSockets. So if you have a similar application, remember please to implement access control also for WebSockets. Do not send excessive data to users. If users are privileged to see only names, send them only names. Verify server side if a user has privileges to access data or perform an operation. Do not rely on client-side validation. It can be easily bypassed. Perform security tests and do threat modeling to detect vulnerabilities in your applications, and train your developers to prevent vulnerabilities. If they understand them and know how to write secure code, it is less likely that they will create code with vulnerabilities. I guess it's all. I hope that you enjoyed our story. And remember, please, if something is popular and publicly available, it is not necessarily well-tested and secure. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's go back to the studio.